All right. Hey guys. Hope y'all are doing well. Couple quick things. This is my last lesson for you in period 2. So we've done period 1 and now we're finishing up period 2, which is also the last day that we'll be talking about unit 3. So the thing is, there's lots of stuff that we haven't quite covered. Now, I could make a couple different lessons out of this, or I could kind of throw everything together without sort of a theme and give you one last lesson so that we can test. So that's what I'm going to do. So the things that we talk about today, we're going to start with the Protestant Reformation. We're going to talk about the spread of Christianity. We're going to talk about the 13 colonies, and we're going to talk about Japan. So we're going to kind of go all over the place. So I'm really sorry that we have to go all over the place, but I think it's much better to throw everything out there so that we can get this test out of the way, okay? So when we are done, guys, period 2, that means we are 50% done with our curriculum of AP World. So that is awesome. And just to let you know, guys, one of the things we talk about today is the Protestant Reformation. It's one of my favorite things to talk about because it's super duper interesting. So this slide right here, this is a scene from the early Protestant Reformation. This dude right here is a guy named Martin Luther, okay? Now, Martin Luther is a very mundane and normal guy, but he is going to cause a schism in the church, and we will talk about that in just a minute. So let's begin. All right. I don't really have a great meme for you today, but have a pretty good lecture. And then we will finish everything up of Unit 3. And as I said, guys, we are still in Unit 3. It is our last day to talk about land-based empires. Okay, so we are also almost done with period 2. Yay! Ignore these dates. Well, I guess don't. Some of you guys are going to be able to watch this video and have your LEQs this Friday. Some of you will have this lesson after you take your LEQs. So congrats if you're finished with your LEQ, and if not, study for it. Make sure you understand that next week, period 2 exam. All right, if you guys are on Blue Day, you will have your period 2 exam on October 28th, which is a Wednesday. And if you guys are my Orange Day, you will have your exam on October 29th, which is a Thursday. All right, your review guides will be due at the start of class by email. All right, and I do not accept late work. I never have. That's in the syllabus. So make sure you have that completed or take a photo of it and be ready to send it to my email account. And as I've told you, I want these in my email account so that at the end of the year, when you're studying for finals or when you're studying for the AP World exam, if you've lost your review guide, I will have it in my email account, okay? And as a reminder, November 13th is the deadline for early payment for your AP World exam. So hopefully y'all take that. All right, not a solid meme, but just as a reminder, guys, those gunpowder empires. Okay, so as I've already told you, this lesson's kind of all over the place. We're going to be talking about Europe, we're going to be talking about the Americas, and we're going to be talking about Japan. So buckle up and settle in and get ready to talk all about all these amazing world regions and some of these really wicked cool stories, okay? Okay, so again, guys, this is gonna be on your period 2 test. These graphics are really helpful. And as we slowly finish up Unit 3, you guys will see that we have talked about every single thing on this chart right here, okay? We've talked about these empires. We did not talk about Russia or the Songhai, but we don't need to. We only needed to cover really the gunpowder empires, okay? We talked about the Qing. We're also gonna talk about Japan a little bit over here. So we've talked about political and religious disputes. We've talked about monumental architecture and tax collection systems. The only thing that we're really missing, guys, is the Protestant Reformation. So let's go ahead and start today's lecture with that. Okay, so as I said to you when I first opened with this video, the Protestant Reformation is going to begin with a guy named Martin Luther. Okay, Martin Luther is a German friar, so he works for the Catholic Church. All right. So guys, in the 1500s, the Catholic Church starts to become sort of like a corporation, a business. Now, at this point, the Catholic Church is a monopoly as well. Everyone in Europe is a Catholic, okay? The British, the Germans, the Dutch, everyone in Scandinavia, all practicing Catholics. Now, the problem is, guys, without a little healthy competition, the Catholic Church can kind of make decisions, okay? All people are going to have to follow it, okay? So here's the problem. We're going to get a little bit of corruption, and you're going to start to see that the Catholic Church is going to start to find ways to exploit people a little bit. So one of the things they're going to do is they're going to allow people to pay for something called indulgences. So please make sure you write this down. So many of you guys are familiar with Christianity, in which if you live a really good life, if you're a good person, after you die, you'll go to heaven, okay? Or if you're a really bad person, you live a terrible life, you'll go to hell, okay? Well, say you kind of live an okay life, all right? The Catholics believe in something called purgatory. So again, you've got heaven, you've got hell. And the Catholics believe that you've got this middle area called purgatory. Now, purgatory is kind of just this spiritual no man's land. So it's not really good or it's not really bad. But the Catholic Church found a way to exploit people's sort of fear of going to purgatory. All right. So what they did was they said that if you paid an indulgence, you would automatically get your one-way ticket to heaven. So essentially, if you were a horrible person, but you paid the Catholic Church a crap ton of money, they were automatically going to give you that one-way ticket up to heaven. Okay? Now, you guys probably remember we talked about the Catholic leader, the man called the Pope. Okay? And the Pope completely condoned this system of indulgences. So Catholicism with the Pope at the head. Now, again, if you're a terrible person, you're going to go to heaven as long as you pay that exorbitant sum of money. Well, what about the people that don't have a lot of money? What about the peasants or the serfs in Europe who live okay lives but can't afford to go to heaven? Right? People started to get really uneasy with this system of exploitation in which the Catholic Church was essentially favoring the rich in order to get more and more wealthy. Okay? And that's when we get this guy right here, this German friar, who is basically a Christian holy man who works for the Catholic Church. And what he does is he's starting to get pissed off, okay? And he takes a piece of paper and he writes down 95 theses, so 95 issues that he has with the church. And the biggest issue he has with the church is indulgences. But since the Pope has condoned indulgences, he's going to have a serious issue with the Pope. So he goes to his place of employment, a church, and he takes these 95 theses and he hammers it into the wall, okay? And in that moment, the Christianity changes forever, okay? It seems really insignificant that a German friar who would just nail something to a wall would change the course of Christianity, but it's super, super important. Because guys, people are already really pissed off at the church, all right? The church is requiring only, or basically saying only people with lots of money can get into heaven. So you have to pay these indulgences or you're gonna go to purgatory, which is not a great place. So Martin Luther essentially believed that salvation comes from your individual faith, all right? Being a good person, and not the institutions of the Catholic Church. And the Pope is the institution of the Catholic Church, okay? And after he nails those 95 theses to the wall, everything changes. You see this break in Christianity. Now remember, prior to Martin Luther, everyone was a practicing Catholic. After this, you have a break in the church. So many of you guys are Protestant here in the American South, okay? You guys are kind of, part of this Protestant Reformation. One way to look at it too is if you've ever heard of the Christian faith Lutheran, it comes from him, all right? Martin Luther, by causing this schism in the church, lots of different faiths are created, all part of Christianity, but with differing views of Christianity, of faith, of heaven, of who is the leader of these churches, all right? And that's where you're going to get all these different sort of sects of Christianity. So you've got the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, the Anglicans, the Baptists, all of these things that are not Catholic, but are still Christianity. Oh, they're sort of humble starts to this guy right here, Martin Luther. So the Protestant Reformation, okay? Think about it like this, guys. Those of you who are Protestants, why do we call them Protestants? Let's look at the word for a second. It's a protest against the Catholic Church, okay? So as I said, lots of Europeans are willing to talk about the problems with the Catholic Church. They're willing to really embrace this schism. They're really willing to embrace these 95 Theses, these issues that they have fundamentally with the Catholic Church, and to start creating their own versions of Christian churches. And I think this chart is really, really helpful. So as I said, guys, Europe is majority Catholic at this point, okay? After this schism after this break in the European Catholic Church, you've got Protestants. And so you have all of these different sects that come out of this Protestant Reformation. And again, it spreads really quickly. Martin Luther was from Germany himself, so it spreads quickly in Germany. It spreads quickly in Britain. Britain's a little bit different, but it will spread there. And it will also spread into the Netherlands, okay? Essentially, these European states are going to stop obeying the Pope, okay? Now, think back to when we talked about Unit 4, and we talked about the 5 maritime-based empires. And I said, you guys all had to know which version of Christianity these 5 maritime-based empires practiced. And we said Spain and Portugal were Catholic, and Britain, the Netherlands, Britain and the Netherlands were Protestant, okay? France is also Catholic. I misspoke there. But guys, these Protestant states are going to stop obeying the Pope, all right? So when the Pope draws that arbitrary line down the Atlantic Ocean called the Treaty of Tordesillas, these European maritime-based empires are not going to follow it, all right? Spain and Portugal will, certainly, because they're Catholic and they still adhere to the Pope's words. But these new Protestant countries, they don't care what the Pope thinks, okay? Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, and all of these new Christian churches that were founded, that came out of it, are going to take Christianity in a different direction. Okay, no longer are they going to have that spiritual head called the Pope at the Vatican in Rome. They're going to do their own thing, all right? Now, even today, guys, Catholics will look back and realize that and say indulgences was a terrible idea, all right? As I said, I grew up Catholic. We don't have indulgences now, but at the time, the Catholic Church was very corrupt, okay? So I got a little bonus meme for you. I love this one. All right, guys, so the Counter-Reformation. So after Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the wall at a Catholic church that he was working at, as we said, this new Protestant faith spreads rapidly throughout Europe, okay? And Catholics are very, very concerned about this. They had a monopoly on all of Europe, and now parts of Europe, Britain, Germany, parts of the Netherlands are now suddenly becoming this new counterfaith, this other version of Christianity, Protestantism, right? And so Catholic reformers are going to act. People aren't happy with what the Pope is allowing with these indulgences, so Catholic reformers are going to work to end these abuses of the Catholic Church. So indulgences will go away. Purgatory will go away, all right? Remember, so this idea of you being a good person and going to heaven, that's going to be re-embraced by the Catholic Church, okay? But the Catholic Church is in pretty serious damage control. So Protestantism is flying through Europe and it's being embraced by lots and lots of people. So the Catholic Church feels like they have to do something. All right. So they're going to send out Jesuit missionaries all over the world to spread Catholicism. All right. So Jesuit missionaries will follow these voyages of exploration into the New World, and they will bring Catholicism into South America, into the Caribbean, all right, into parts of Africa. They will try to bring Catholicism into Japan, and that will be a mistake, which we will talk about in just a second. All right, so as Protestantism is flying through Europe, so too is Catholicism. It is being embraced all over the world, okay? So I think this map is really helpful. Again, before Martin Luther, all of this, guys, was orange. After Martin Luther, look, huge chunks of Europe are now Protestant. And again, these are probably ancestors to the faiths that you all practice today. Okay, so shifting gear a little bit, we need to talk about something called absolutism, okay? Now, absolutism is relatively new in period 2, and it's kind of a new political theory, but it also sort of has roots in those early traits of a civilization. So you guys probably remember, I told you that in early civilizations and early empires, the political leader was usually going to be kind of intertwined with the religious leader, okay? So the religious leaders will have the power to kind of endorse political leaders, and political leaders will also have the power to endorse religious leaders, and they will be intertwined, okay? Well, absolutism kind of takes that to another step. So this is going to be a new political theory, all right? And it basically decrees that the king of a given place will be chosen by God. So essentially, if you live in France and your king is going to be, you know, Louis XIV, he was chosen by God to be your ruler. So God ruled that his father would be king and that he would be the son, and he was meant to be your king. So the leader is going to be chosen by God himself, okay? Now, this is normally something you see in Catholic kingdoms, but not always. So you will see it in all Christian kingdoms, mostly Catholic, but not always Catholic, okay? And again, essentially, whomever this leader is, they have been chosen by God, and they must have all the power. Whatever they decree is God's word, all right? So if Louis XIV decrees that you have to give up all of your money to him, you have to do it because that comes straight from God, okay? Another name for absolutism is the divine right theory. So again, God has given divine right, so divine right as in basically spiritual, the right to rule people, okay? So obviously, it's hard for us to understand now, mostly because we don't really have kings and queens so much anymore, or they don't really have the kinds of power. But absolutism is exactly what it is right here. It's absolute power, okay? A king that practices absolutism or believes in the divine right theory can basically say to his subjects, you know, anything. You have to pay all of your money in taxes, you know, you all have to practice Catholicism, you all have to practice Protestantism, you all have to go to church every single Sunday. And the subjects have to do it because it is believed that he is projecting the word of God, okay? Now, College Board wants you to know this guy, all right? Some of you probably heard of him. He's really quite interesting. So probably the most important example of absolutism is Louis XIV, okay? So Louis XIV is going to be a king in France. So he's a French monarch who gives himself the name the Sun King. So Louis XIV is very unique. He will take all power within France. All of sort of the little smaller states, the French states that used to compete with each other, they will all begin to practice absolutism. They will worship the Sun King, who has been given the divine right by God to rule. And Louis XIV he will raise taxes, he will rule with an iron fist, and he will be famous for a lot of things, including the building of Versailles. So please do not pronounce this Versailles. In French, this is Versailles. Now, some of you guys may have been to Versailles. It is a beautiful, fantastic palace just outside of Paris, France. And Versailles is going to be an example of monumental architecture because Louis is so powerful, he's so rich, that he is able to devote manpower and time and money to building this fabulous castle for himself, okay? Now he is going to take power away from the lords and he is going to keep it all for himself and for his ancestors. So his son, Louis XV, and then eventually his grandson, Louis XVI, whose death will be pretty awful, but we will talk about that later on in period 3, okay? So if you guys have never been to Versailles, it's amazing, but it's also gaudy and ridiculous, and the idea that someone paid this much money for this castle is just wild. This is just an example of what it looks like. I've been to Versailles a few times myself. It's amazing. The history is incredible. The other thing about Versailles is that later on in history, many world treaties will be signed here. So the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 will end World War I. The Treaty of Versailles in, I believe, 1783 will actually be signed here, and the British will surrender to the Americans from the American Revolution. So lots of cool things will eventually happen in Versailles. But what you need to know about it in period 2 is that it's an example of monumental architecture. And it could only be built because the leader who built it was practicing absolutism, all right? He required all of his subjects to do exactly what he said, and he used their taxpayer money and labor to build this. And it's beautiful, but it's kind of a waste of money. Okay, so shifting gears again. So we went from the Protestant Reformation to absolutism, and now we're going to talk about settler colonies, and in particular, one settler colony, one in which we're all sitting in right now in the state of Georgia. But before we get there, I need you to write down this definition. So what is a settler colony? Well, it seems kind of an intuitive definition, but we're going to talk about them quite a bit in period 3, so I'll need you to write that down. So essentially, a settler colony is a form of colonialism. So colonialism is like going abroad and creating a colony in a new land in which you will control from the motherland, okay? But settler colonies also kind of seek to replace the original population. So we have an example of settler colonialism here in the United States. So colonies, European colonies established here in the 13 colonies, they brought, French people, British people, Dutch people here to kind of replace the Native Americans. So this was our new land. We're not really worried about the people who were here, the indigenous populations who were here before. So basically, you're going to take people from Europe, and you're going to put them on boats, and you're going to send them to these colonies here to create a new colony, to create a new country. Okay, so this colonized territory will be a new society of settlers. So some of the very famous ones are Plymouth Rock, Jamestown, trying to think of one in Georgia, but I can't right now. So Plymouth Rock, Jamestown, this Thanksgiving story, all those really, those New England ones, all those former European citizens who were brought here to practice their own religious faiths, and essentially to kind of replace whomever was here to start, okay? So the most famous one, obviously, is the one we're sitting in here in Georgia, although I guess we're not technically sitting in it since we're kind of over here, but we're in the same state, so Georgia. Britain and the 13 colonies. So Britain is Protestant. So during the Protestant Reformation, Britain will they will found their own Protestant faith. They'll be Anglican. And so people that will come over here and settle their colony will practice Protestantism. Okay, eventually Catholics will also come. But Britain will not rule the 13 colonies like an absolute monarchy. So I know that many of you probably think that during the Revolution, Americans love to say taxation without representation. But Britain did not rule the 13 colonies as an absolute monarchy, practicing absolutism. For the most part, a lot of colonists had their own self-rule. So a lot of these small colonies were able to elect their own form of representative government. But what was practiced was mercantilism. So guys, remember, mercantilism is basically when you take raw resources and you send them to a mother country, and the mother country sells it back to you for more money. Okay, it's that idea that there is a finite amount of resources in the world. And so the 13 colonies, all those resources from these colonies were meant to make the mother country richer, okay? So I think this is a really helpful little example of mercantilism. What you need to know, guys, about the 13 colonies is essentially that the resources that they exploited for Britain, up north, you had lumber, fish, and pelts. So a pelt is essentially like when you kill a beaver and you skin it and you use its fur. So Europeans love beaver skin hats. I don't know. I don't really see the appeal myself, but hey, whatever. Whatever floats your boat, I guess. And in the South, you're going to see tobacco. It will heavily be grown. Tobacco, again, will be sent back to Britain, will be refined and sold as cigarettes. In the South, what you do need to know is that tobacco and later rice and later cotton, these items will be grown by a mixture, in period 2, by a mixture of enslaved people and indentured servants. Now, later on, there won't be indentured servants. But again, in period 2, so 1450 to 1750, the South will be using a mixture of enslaved people and indentured servants. Now, let me talk about the difference between these two, because they are very different, even if many people get them mixed up. So, an enslaved person is someone who, this is a lifelong condition, all right? So we talked about the East Indian Ocean African slave trade. We talked about the transatlantic slave trade. Those people who were stolen from East and West Africa, this is a condition in which they were not necessarily born into, but they were sold into slavery, and there they were slaves for the rest of their lives. There was no voluntary choice to become an enslaved person, and there was no choice to be able to overcome that condition. Furthermore, an enslaved person's children would inherently also be slaves, okay? An indentured servant is different. Now, it is coerced labor, but it is a choice, okay? So essentially, indentured servants were poor Europeans. So they were very, in the social hierarchy of Europe, remember those peasants at the bottom? Many of them wanted to leave Europe in order to get higher in a social hierarchy, okay? So what they did was they agreed to work on a colony plantation. So usually they agreed to work for 7 years. So what they would do is they would take a contract in Europe, they would sign their name to it, and agree to work for 7 years as a indentured servant. And during this time, or in return for this, they were given passage from Europe on a boat to the 13 colonies. So for 7 years, while in the colonies, they farmed, they grew tobacco, whatever was going on up north, they cut down trees for lumber. And basically they had to work for 7 years. Now they were provided with homes, they were provided with food, but they were not paid, all right? Their payment was already given to them in the passage over from Europe, okay? Now, after that 7 years was finished, these people were essentially freed. Usually they were also given land. And sort of the rule of thumb is after 7 years, indentured servants received 40 acres, okay? So again, indentured servitude is not a lifelong condition. So you need to know the difference between an indentured servant and an enslaved person. And essentially it is this: one was a choice and one was not. One was voluntary, one was not. One was lifelong and the other one was 4 to 7 years. All right. One, you were born free if your parents were indentured servants. You were not born free if your parents were enslaved people. Okay. If somehow an enslaved person could escape slavery, they were not given land after that condition. Okay. So make sure you understand the difference between these two labor conditions. Now, Protestant Reformation, Absolutism, 13 colonies. Now we get to talk about my favorite place in the entire world. So I probably have told you guys this, but I lived in Japan for a year. I did my junior year of high school in Japan. So I love, love, love Japan. And I will say this, in period 2, Japan is not very important. It's not quite as important as the land-based empires like the Mughal, the Safavids, the Ottomans, but it's going to become very, 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 very important in period 3. And before we talk about them in period 3, we have to talk about why they eventually become so important. And frankly, in period 2, they're kind of isolated. They're kind of just doing their own thing. They're keeping the Europeans out. They don't want to industrialize. They don't want to trade. They're just kind of staying on their island doing their own thing. But what you need to know in period 2, Japan is going to be feudal. So similar to what Europe looked like in period 1. So the majority of people will be serfs. So there'll be kind of that social hierarchy. The serfs will be at the bottom. So these serfs will be farmers. They will be growing rice and serving a lord, a Japanese daimyo, which you don't have to write down. So, but you have kind of the emperor at the top. You've got people who own a lot of land called the daimyo, and then you've got serfs at the bottom. But they also have a warrior class. So kind of similar to how European feudalism had the knights. So the samurai were charged with protecting the Japanese serfs. They were also charged with protecting the landowners and the emperor, okay? So I'm sure you guys have heard the word samurai, and they're pretty cool, okay? Very elite warriors. So in Japan, there will be an emperor, and it's kind of cool because the Japanese royal family, which still rules Japan today, they're actually going to be the oldest family in the world that is still ruling. Now, I can't give you exact dates right now, but the Japanese royal family, which again, still exists in 2020, they have been ruling longer than any other family in the world, like one single bloodline. But the Japanese emperor in history has never really had a lot of power. So the emperor, he has power in name, so he's heavily worshipped by the Japanese people. But in reality, he's kind of just a figurehead. He's a figurehead today, and he's a figurehead in period 2. So he wasn't always a figurehead, but there's going to be something a little bit different that rules Japan. And it's a little bit different than this period 1 European feudalism that I'm drawing comparisons to. So in Japan, even though the emperor in name has absolute power, what actually happens is that there's something called the shogun. So the Tokugawa shogunate, all right, the shogun here, is actually going to be the one that rules Japan. So you've got the emperor, but again, he's just nothing more than a figurehead. And instead, you've got this guy, the shogun. Now, The shogun is kind of like a military leader, a very, very powerful family in Japan that eventually was able to seize power. It's going to be founded by this guy right here, Ieyasu Tokugawa, all right, which is why that's called the Tokugawa shogunate. All right, so the shogunate is going to have their own castle in Kyoto, and they're going to be the true powerhouse of Japan. Okay, so again, emperor, figurehead in name only, the shogun. Okay, and then all the way at the bottom, you're going to have the serfs. So what's going on in Japan? Well, not too much. Besides the emperor losing power to the shogunate, not too much is going on in Japan. One of the things that Japan is really, really good at is staying isolated, all right? This is kind of like what Japan is, or sorry, kind of what the Ming and the Qing are doing in China. Japan doesn't want to deal with the Europeans. All right, they don't want these trading posts. They don't want to trade with the Europeans. They're not interested in these luxury goods. They're especially not interested in European religions. All right, they're exceptional at getting rid of Catholic and Christian missionaries. There's actually a fantastic movie, if you guys are interested. Andrew Garfield's in it. It's called The Silence. And it's a really good movie that shows how the Japanese were able to fight back against European Christian missionaries. So remember, we said that after the Protestant Reformation, Catholics and Protestants were sending out lots of missionaries in order to try to spread the faith, okay? Now, Christian missionaries arrived in Japan to bring Catholicism, and the Japanese hated it, okay? The Japanese essentially killed any one of those Jesuit priests that came in, and they killed anyone who became a Christian, okay? They outlawed Christianity, they killed priests, they killed missionaries, and they killed anyone who had converted to Christianity, okay? That all being said, they did allow one European trading post, but just one. All right, they allowed the Dutch to have a trading post in Nagasaki. So you might recognize Nagasaki because that will be a city that becomes important in World War II. Okay, but that is going to be the one trading post they have, and it's actually not going to be that important. It will be the only European or any sort of outside influence that Japan will experience. And for the most part, guys, Japan wants to remain isolated. They do not want to trade with the outside world. They are not interested in becoming Christian. They're not interested in trading with the Europeans. They don't want to deal with the Europeans, okay? And you need to keep this in mind because in period 3, they're going to be forced to deal with the Europeans and the Americans. And it's going to get pretty ugly. So remember, period 2, Japan wants to stay isolated and closed, okay? And this picture is pretty gory, but this is a picture of what the Japanese did if they found out you became a Christian, okay? The Japanese had their own religion, which you don't have to know about, but they did not want Christianity in, okay? They did not want any European influence. Okay, so as I said to you guys at the start of this lecture, this was gonna be my last lesson before our period 2 exam. And I know I kind of went all over the place. You know, we talked about the Protestant Reformation, absolutism, Louis XIV and the Sun King and Versailles and all that cool stuff. We talked about settler colonies, the 13 colonies here from Britain in the future US. And we ended my favorite country in the whole world talking about Japan, okay? So you need to finish up your review guides. You should be able to do so now since this is essentially the last lesson. If you have any questions, make sure to email me before test day. There might be some questions you don't know on your review guide, so go ahead and send me an email, okay? If you're watching this because you missed class, please send me an email about missed work, okay? So good luck on your period 2 exam. I know you guys are gonna be great. And yay, we are done with period 2. Congrats, guys. So much AP World curriculum finished. All right, see y'all in class.